follow the presentation by the World Bank colleagues. Firstly, the way I understand it is that good governance, transparency, and accountability matters for good development outcomes. Its elements include the characteristics of political institutions. And here I want to emphasize political institutions because I think it's something that perhaps the authors try to say that the book is not political, and I think it is to a large extent politically oriented. State capacity and how the state regulates economic institutions. Secondly, the region marked by a government deficit falls short on both transparency and accountability, which has really affected growth in a negative sense. Thirdly, there is a lack of dynamism between a new labor market entrance and scarcity of high productivity jobs in the private sector. In other words, the lack of dynamism in the labor market. And this lack of dynamism is in turn reflected in growing spatial inequality within MENA countries, being the highest in the world, this lack. Rising spatial inequalities undermine social stability and economic growth. Of note is that weak governance exacerbates spatial inequalities, and weak governance dominates in the region indeed. As a result, we have political bias in spatial allocation of central government grants. Fourthly, this calls for reforming the governance of the countries in the region, whereby development focus will shift from large-scale capital investments to identifying local needs and tailoring solutions to address local markets and coordination failures. Finally, this is something I would like to address to Roberta. Despite its strong call for governance reform, it is maintained that the book is not about political systems. Rather, it is, among other things, about accountability systems that can help the state be more effective in responding to the needs of its citizens in times of high uncertainty. But does this not require the prevalence of a political system that responds to these needs? In other words, one that does not fall short on good governance? The line, in my view, that divides political and government systems is very, very thin indeed. In this regard, I'm very happy, very glad the report refers to the Lebanese example, where, as it points out, entrenched rent-seeking elites plunged the country into one of the world's most severe economic collapses since the 1850s. Imagine, since the 1850s. I would like to add, it is our successive post-Civil War governments, elites, who are fully responsible for the economic and financial disaster that has come before Lebanon. To try to address the region's to try to address the report's messages, the country's political governance is in urgent need of reform. So what I'm trying to say, Roberta, is that I know that the world institutions do not like to talk about politics, but this, in my view, the political message of the report is very, very clear. And the distinction between political and economic, governance in this respect is rather difficult to separate. But I leave it to you, Roberta. Please go ahead and let's hear you. Roberta.
Thank you, Dr. Samir, for the kind hospitality. To you, thank you, and also to ERF. And in terms of introduction that put the speaker on the spot, I think this wins the award. However, I think I will disappoint you because although the line between politics and policy might be fine, here we are advocating something that I think belongs to the sphere of policy and that our countries can address even if we don't talk about politics. Let me see if I can convince you and convince our audience of that. So with this question mark for the conversation, let me just say that the work that we present is part of a choral effort, which is all represented in a edited volume, which accompanies the semi-annual update of the Middle East and North Africa region that was issued in October in concomitance with the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. Like these reports usually go, we have an initial part on the macro outlook, and we had the opportunity, and many thanks again to ERF, to discuss it in December with Dr. Hoda and Dr. Daniel and Dr. Ibrahim. Now we focus on this spotlight theme, which is transparency and accountability. And what we claim in this report, looking at the question from different sectors, is that reforming towards more transparency, better measurement, and more learning is the cheapest and most effective policy that MENA countries can do right now. But let me just give you a sense of the key messages and why of this logical argument, and then we can go a little bit on what's the background where we build on. So if we think about this past year, the MENA region has been a little bit of an exception worldwide because we had the highest growth in the past decade, hovering around 5.5%. This growth was fueled, as we know very well, by oil prices, which sort of buoyed the growth of oil exporters. But what we see in the average numbers masks a divergence within the regions. Oil exporters have done particularly well, but growth is on a true trajectory. And we know that oil importers, countries such as Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and Dr. Samir, you spoke about Lebanon, are facing very different type of vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities are definitely heightened by the polycrisis environment in which we live. But what we claim in this report is that these vulnerabilities have deep roots in a governance deficit, and a deficit particularly of transparency and accountability. We'll see that the work of Dr. Hans and Dr. Hoda will speak directly to measured accountability in the region. They will speak directly to dimensions of transparency, such as data openness. But the big point that we want to make here is that in the face of continuous crisis and continuous uncertainty, as you've said, Dr. Samir, greater transparency and accountability really give a sense of how to walk a different path. There is an expression that has been, I think, attributed to a discourse on Chinese policy, which is crossing the river by feeling the stones. And this is exactly what we try to advocate in this report, of building bureaucracies and governments that are able to measure what they do, to take stock of the effectiveness of what they do, and to course correct as needed. This is even more important now because we are in times of heightened uncertainties. It's important always. And what we claim, and that's an easy claim to make, it's also cheap to do. So these reforms on governance at times of fiscal space concerns are not only high returns, but they are also low cost. And that's why we called our report a new state of mind. And by a new state of mind, really, we mean a bureaucracy, a learning state that really can work progressively. And as Dr. Somik will say in his intervention, looking at regional and spatial development, going from monumental to incremental. So let me just give you a sense of how the book is articulated, and you will see here the choral element of what we wrote, which looks at both cross-cutting themes. And here we'll have them represented by Dr. Hoda, who will talk about accountability, Dr. Hans, who will talk about the evolving case for investing in better data and better measurement. And then we'll go into sectoral deep dives. And Dr. Federica will talk about how these ideas of better governance and better accountability could be the game changer in the space of jobs. And I think that a lot of the discourse that I hear right now in these times about Egypt and the structural reforms that it needs to cross this different moment are exactly along these lines. And then we'll have the opportunity to have Dr. Somik to talk about how moving from monumental, from large infrastructure investment to incremental can really be the game changer for the region. But my role today is just to give you a sense of the background of where we are moving from. As I said, we're living an exceptional year in terms of growth, but also an exceptional year in terms of shocks that have heightened the vulnerabilities of the region. These vulnerabilities are apparent whenever we look at economic growth in the 21st century. Economic growth has been anemic, and what you see here on the left are annual growth rates for all of our countries over the past 20 years. And only Morocco, Egypt, and to some extent, Tunisia and Djibouti have actually been able to be at par with the average growth of their income group. We also see disappointing growth in productivity, which is proxied here by total factor productivity. We know very well that the growth in the region has not been accompanied by jobs. And this is particularly painful in a region where in a region, and you'll see it in the next slide, in a region that is rich of young people and therefore is the best place from its demographic development to reap off the benefits of the demographic dividend. Unfortunately, however, not only jobs are too few, and you see this reflected in high unemployment, and you see here on the right-hand side youth unemployment, but also jobs are not of the quality that we would want. And what you see is high shares of informal unemployment across the whole region. What has happened is that this difficult situation on the job side is reflected on low and declining life satisfaction. What you see here on the left-hand side is life satisfaction is measured by Gallup polls, plotted vis-a-vis GDP per capita. Some countries are on the line, a few are above, but the majority are below what you would predict given their income level. And we can see that over time, life satisfaction is also decreased in the region. An important element of this decreased life satisfaction is the fact that fragility and conflict have increased. And what you see here from the Fragile State Index, you see something that we know already, is that fragility has increased dramatically in Yemen, has persisted in Iraq, has increased in Syria and in Libya in the aftermath of what we know as the Arab Spring. Now, in the face of these challenges, the region needs to think about structural reform. We will give you, as the presentation unfolds, the sense that transparency and accountability are two dimensions where the region is falling short. And we will give you, I hope, a convincing evidence for why improving transparency and accountability is the best bet that the region can make at this time. But let me turn now to Dr. Hoda, who will tell you about new evidence on accountability for the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberta. So as Roberta just mentioned, I will discuss, this section will discuss accountability in the region. And we rely heavily on the work of Luhrmann, Marcadet, and Mekova, who define and measure accountability. So they define accountability as de facto constraints on the government's use of political power. And they decompose accountability into three dimensions. The first one is vertical accountability, which refers to the ability of citizens to hold the government accountable through elections. The second one is horizontal accountability, which refers to the ability of other state institutions to monitor the government. And the third one is diagonal accountability, which refers to the role of civil society and the media in holding the government accountable. And these three types of accountability, or three dimensions of accountability, we will showcase how they are for the MENA vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So here, this bar chart shows the residuals for the aggregate accountability measure in blue, and for the three subtypes, the vertical in red, the horizontal in green, and the diagonal in orange. And these residuals are obtained as the difference between the observed accountability scores and the fitted value from a regression of accountability scores on log GDP per capita. So what this basically means is that if you have positive residuals, this signifies that the accountability scores are on average higher than what would be predicted by your income level. If you have negative residuals, this means that you have your accountability scores are lower than your income comparators. And we can see here that for North America, Latin America, and Caribbean, Europe, and Central Asia, they all have positive residuals, which means that their accountability scores are higher than what would be predicted by their income level. If you look at, there's only 2 regions who have negative residuals, East Asia and Pacific, and Middle East and North Africa, which means that their accountability scores are lower than what would be predicted by their income level. But we can see clearly that for Middle East and North Africa, it is the worst performer. It has the highest negative residuals in all measures of accountability, which means that it underperforms significantly with respect to other regions and with respect to their income comparators. We can also see that the Middle East and North Africa performs the worst in diagonal accountability and relatively better in horizontal and vertical accountability. This in this slide, we see a scatter plot of accountability scores and log per capita gross domestic product, and you can see that you can see a solid line which represents the regression of the average accountability score on log GDP per capita, and a dashed line which represents the average accountability score in the sample. The MENA countries are shown in red dots, and you can see that countries in the MENA and North Africa, they significantly underperform their income peers in all dimensions of accountability, and they are also, or most of them are also have lower than average accountability scores. One thing we can notice is that high income and extremely resource-rich MENA countries also perform much worse compared to other MENA countries and to their income comparators. One other thing we look at is the relationship between accountability and trust in government, which is a key political measure. And here we use data on trust in institutions from the Gallup World Poll for a sample of 151 countries from 2006 to 2020. And our dependent variable here is trust in institutions, which is basically the share of respondents who mention in the Gallup polls that they trust different institutions, that they have confidence in the governments, in the courts, in police, in the military. And accountability, as I discussed before, is measured as an aggregate index, but also with its 3 sub-dimensions: vertical, horizontal, and diagonal. And the results, as you can see, shows that vertical and horizontal accountability are positively associated with trust in institutions, which suggests that countries which have higher vertical and horizontal accountability also have higher levels of trust in institutions. And this suggests that these 2 channels, and particularly horizontal accountability, are important in increasing transparency and in increasing trust of citizens' trust in their governments and in the government's institutions. We can also see that for diagonal accountability, it is negatively correlated with trust in institutions. And we believe that these results suggest that accountability is a key element in improving trust in citizens' trust in institutions, but that it is required that all 3 dimensions of accountability are improved together, particularly vertical and horizontal accountability. So, as you can see here, accountability is a cornerstone of good governance, and it's important for improving societal trust in public institutions. And it's important that all 3 dimensions of accountability are improved together. We've seen that MENA countries significantly underperform compared to their income comparators, and which is why it's important for like the dimension of accountability is very important, and it's important for MENA countries to work on these 3 dimensions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please, the next speaker is who is going to speak next?
Yeah, that's me.
Hans?
Hans? Yes, I go by Hans. So I'll be talking a bit about a data openness and particularly focus on micro data. So the question you may ask is why would we be so interested in micro data? And my first answer to that is, well, micro data are still in many ways the backbone of our statistical systems. Yes, our countries are becoming increasingly digital, and being digital means that we can generate a lot of statistics from administrative systems, and we're working on that, and we're moving in that direction. But despite that, all our statistical systems, wherever you are across the globe, still depend on the collection of microdata, either in the form of censuses, so population and economic censuses to measure sort of the size of our population, their characteristics, the size of our economy and its characteristics, as well as a lot of very specific surveys to fill in the gaps on issues of related to the labor force, to better understand consumption and to measure, for instance, the CPI. We need to do regular enterprise and health surveys to get a good sense of how our economy and how our populations are doing. And of course, then sort of, why would we care? Well, we care because both our public officials and our private sector really require up-to-date data for their decision making. And I think, at least to me, this became very clear during the COVID crisis, when suddenly statistical agencies had great difficulty producing information, whereas the world around us was changing very rapidly. And responding to that crisis became increasingly difficult because we were all struggling to understand what was actually going on. And in some ways, we are facing a similar situation now, that suddenly, after a long time, inflation rates are very high, and we are starting to struggle to figure out who's being affected, who might require additional protections, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's microdata will help us address or help us understand a lot of the issues in our economies better. Think about the question that Roberta raised. We are seeing high growth or relatively high growth, but no jobs being created. Why is that? And we really need microdata to answer those questions. And of course, this importance of microdata shows up in the sense that, to the extent that these data are available and there is data transparency, we see that economies actually face higher rates of growth. And that's pretty understandable why there is such an association. And there's literature on this to demonstrate it. So there's evidence showing that if countries sign up to the SDDI from the IMF, their cost of borrowing goes down. Of course, because with greater transparency comes less risk to the lender, and that gets related into interest rates. Better data leads to improved policy decisions, or if you like, fewer bad decisions, which can be very costly. It's much easier to come to a consensus about what may have to change in our societies if there's actually data available, and if we can have our discussions based on an objective basis. And data will help us improve our social contracts, basically because once we have data about the state of our economy or how our population is doing, it's much easier to design the policies that are needed to help our citizens. Now, if you look at the state of play of microdata in the MENA region, the situation is very concerning, I would say. And we did some work, very simple work actually, where we visited the websites of all the statistical agencies in the region and checked whether the agency had collected any of any censuses and core surveys recently. Recently being, we would expect a census to be done at least every 10 years. Some countries do economic censuses every 5 years, but we kept a cut-off point of at least every 10 years. And you would expect core surveys like health surveys and consumption surveys to be done at least every 5 years. And then it's one thing to do these surveys, it's another to make them, the data then publicly available, so that this information is not just available within government circles, but also to the much wider society. And what we find is that sort of all these cells, you'd like all these cells to be filled and actually green, because green means the data is recent and is publicly available. That happens in very few instances. Most of the cells are either red, meaning the data is not even being collected, or orange, meaning the data has been collected but is not made available. And so if you look across the region, maybe at best sort of half the surveys and micro data sets that we would expect to be available are available, and even fewer are shared publicly. Now that's really concerning. If you let's go back, because just imagine what this means. For instance, a number like GDP growth, right? There's so many countries that don't have a recent economic census. There's so many countries that don't do regular enterprise surveys. There's so many countries that are not even measuring their level of consumption regularly. And then you start asking the question, what are we actually presenting and measuring when we're doing, for instance, our national accounts? And that's just one of the most basic statistics, I think, about our economy. So I think this is really an area for concern. Now, the question you can then ask is, why is this the case, right? And in some ways, I find this a bit surprising, because doing surveys is not rocket science, and the technical capability is certainly available across the region. There are very good statisticians in each of our countries. If you think about what it costs to do surveys, the financing needs are absolutely minimal, certainly compared to the size of our economies. And so a lack of capacity is probably not the reason why these microdata are so hard to come by, or maybe sometimes our statistical offices are not sort of completely up to standard. But then you'd argue that that's basically the reflection of a policy choice to underfund them or to undercapacitate them relative to what's available in the economy. And that's really a pity, because I think increasingly our reliance on statistics becomes heavier. Our economies are rapidly becoming more complex, and the rates of change are really accelerating. And that's apart from the fact that we're all facing all these shocks at the moment that really require information to help us make decisions. And so the point where I think I end up is that it may be a political decision to underinvest in microdata, but I wonder why that is the case. And maybe in the past there were reasons to want to be careful about putting statistics out in the public domain, because they could be used to create resentment or whatever. Sometimes you hear these arguments, but I think increasingly those arguments become less valid, as well as, frankly speaking, many of our authorities have become extremely adept at managing information at spin, if you like. And so I think even that potential risk has declined a lot. Whereas I think the opportunity cost of not providing statistics, of not using statistics, of not having them available are really increasing. And so with that, I think I'd like to end making really a plea that this is the moment in time to really sort of reconsider our stance on investing in microdata, taking note of the fact that some of the countries in our region are actually doing it. If we go back to the graph, a country like Palestine actually is up to date and does share all its microdata sets. A country like Iran does labor force and welfare surveys annually, and it makes all its data available online. And so I think there's good examples in the region that other countries could follow and benefit from. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johannes. May I give the floor to Federica? Federica?
Yes. Hi. Thank you, Dr. Sami. Hello, everyone. So I'll talk about jobs and good governance for jobs. So I would like to start. We heard Roberta today. We have heard repeatedly over the past years that about the jobs challenges that the region face. And before I explain what we measure when we talk about governance for jobs, I just would like to remind ourselves that for the creation of more and better jobs, the more productive jobs in the region, which is what is missed, private sector dynamism is an essential ingredient because that's the demand for labor. Like, how many firms enter the market, to what extent they invest, if they're productive or not. Those all matters because they translate in how many jobs we create, in labor mobility, in wages. So we need that dynamisms, and unfortunately, the governance model in the region, which is then drenched in favoritism, discourages precisely private sector dynamism. And there is it's a governance model that is really based on special groups that receive rents, and that is really based on biased public policy. Now the charts, I put a few charts now. I put animation so they're coming along all together. But the first one I wanted to describe is the one on young firms, because that is symptomatic of the fact that there is no such dynamism in the region. There is a small share of young firms in the market compared to income peers. So you see the MENA countries are green, the income peers are the blue. And we also managed to compare not only the share of young firms at the moment with data in 2019, but also how many young firms we had in the market in 2012. And you can see that for the MENA countries, the green group, not only that share it's smaller than income peers, but also it is declining, and is declining significantly for Egypt, for Jordan, or for some countries were already low. Now, this is very concerning because the role that young firms play in creating the better jobs, the new jobs, is well documented, not only globally, but in the region as well. And the other chart shows the share of political connection by firm size. That for the first time this year, speaking about the importance of data availability, we had in our World Bank Enterprise surveys, we asked this question, about political connection to 23,000 firms across Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, and Central Asia. And in MENA, not surprisingly, that share was quite high, was 8%. In some countries, is really very high, like Tunisia, that goes over 30%. And you can see that large firms are more politically connected than others. And this is important because politically connected firms have few incentives to be dynamic, to be productive. And so they don't create the many jobs that we need. And they can compensate for the fact that having so many connected firms, politically connected firms, discourages other firms to enter, to grow. So they can compensate for the lack of creation of good jobs that is due to that lack of competitiveness, due to that connection. Next slide, please. So we focus in the chapter on a specific dimension of governance, which is the role that government play as facilitator of that dynamism in terms of firm entry, firm formation, firm growth, what we call the market contestability. And there is one group of laws and regulation that really matters for good governance in the product market, which is the product market regulations. And not surprisingly, in the region, this data is not available. So we collected ourselves in 8 MENA countries, and we were able to compare them for the first time with 37 high-income countries and 14 upper-middle-income countries. And I would like to just, if you can click one more time. So what this product market regulations measure, it is the scope of state-owned enterprises, So the ownership, the control, and you can see that very often the authority act as businesses and regulators, the governance of state enterprises, public procurement, how the governments get involved, and so on. And I would like to highlight 3 results. One, which is shown in the charts that is difficult to read in this slide, but I'll just pass the message that you can see visually, which is the following. There is a high state presence of state-owned enterprises in the product market, which depresses dynamisms, and more importantly, is not justified by natural monopolies. In fact, we find this high presence of SOEs in trade, construction, manufacturing, and you can compare MENA with the income peers by looking at the colors. So the MENA is the green bar, and you can see that the green bar is consistently present across all industries. While for the income peers, at the bottom, it's where instead, those are the sector where private sector firms normally thrives, like there is no justification for state-owned presence. And you see that the bars are much smaller. So that means that in those industries, firms run the show, not the government. And this is goes against the need of leveling the playing field in the product market, that to go back to my initial message, we need to create the more and better job. So the first results, the finding then, it is the high presence of state-owned enterprises in all industries. Now, the second results, the next slides, please. It is that there is no competitive neutrality. We found all sorts of privileges, preferential treatment, subsidies in favor of state-owned enterprises, the preferential access to credit, to subsidies, exemption from competition laws, preferences in public procurement, all elements that distort significantly the environment, so discourage firms to enter and to stay competitive and to grow. And the third result is that we also found retail price control that still favors the incumbent, the firms that are already in the market. And so this chart, again, focus on the green color and see the higher bar for MENA compared to income peers, where in certain industries, there is no need to control the prices because there is no need to favor anyone. And I would like to conclude this by saying that when we think about good governance for jobs, we have to think about the role of businesses and the firms play in creating jobs. But we also need to think, the relationship with the workers, because that also impacts the way firms run their business and impacts workers themselves. So there are 2 sets of law that are highly complementary to what I just described, to the product market regulation, which is labor regulation and what we call the gendered laws. Now, the labor regulation, we collected data in the region for the chapter, and you can see that they actually remain very limited, they remain costly, there are significant restrictions, which, as I said, penalize businesses and penalize workers at the end of the day. But also there is still huge room for reforms when it comes to gendered laws. Women also face restrictions. And globally and in MENA too, you can see that when certain restrictions for women are removed, we find more women in managerial positions globally, and the red dots in the scatter that you see at the bottom are the MENA countries, and you can see that they score very low in the World Bank Women Business and the Law Index that measure the degree of those restrictions. But you also see that the positive correlation holds for MENA too. So just would like to make a plea for that specific aspect, which in a region where women are highly educated and definitely unemployed and underemployed, because it's a very important priority. And with that, I'll pass the floor. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Federica. The floor is for you, Somik.
Thank you, Professor Samir. I think in your opening remarks, you made an important point about spatial disparities within countries. And what I will do in my allocated 5 minutes is to elaborate on that a bit further. If you could go to the next slide, please. So, colleagues, spatial inequalities within countries in MENA are greater than any comparable country in any other part of the world. And in the context of the report that Roberta and colleagues have put together, governance has to have an important role with fiscal policy, especially how fiscal transfers are affecting spatial disparities. So, colleagues around the world, there's something very peculiar with development. As countries move from being low incomes to becoming high incomes, the difference between regions in explaining inequality decreases. And the importance of differences among people within region increases. And in fact, when we look at the data globally, what we find is that household consumption in the most prosperous areas of today's low and middle income countries are about double that of similar households in lagging areas. And this is compared to about 50% in high income. But in the Middle East and North Africa, a region that we see comprised largely of middle income countries, the differences in household consumption between subnational regions, they account for 63% more to total inequality than in comparable countries. This is a major issue, and MENA is an outlier. So what we have done in this report is to provide global evidence and benchmark it in MENA using household surveys on spatial inequality. What's presented here is a cross-section, but we also have it over time. Next slide, please. But it's not that decision makers in the region are not aware of this. They are fully aware of spatial disparities. I've worked in Egypt, I've worked in Morocco, I've worked in Lebanon. They're very, very aware of this. And they have made a lot of effort to reduce these disparities and respond to the need of people that are left behind. And in fact, when you look at national policy documents, convergence in living standards is a pretty important goal in national policy documents. Yet when we look at the evidence, spatial disparities haven't gone down. They've in fact been rising. So you may ask, okay, what's going on? And here, governance seems to be a major issue. And weak governance is really worsening spatial inequalities through two channels. They're distinct, but they're related. First is the slide in front of you. And many of you know of stories about new cities in Egypt. But I want to tell you more broadly that investment decisions of allocating resources are extremely centralized in most countries in MENA. And you know, the idea of leaving no one behind equals doing the same thing everywhere. So we don't adjust programs and designs based on local preferences or on needs. And we don't provide mechanisms to make local governments accountable to the residents or seek feedback on what works, what doesn't. And in fact, the default mode of planning and allocating resources is decided by line ministries at the sectoral level. And in fact, large-scale public infrastructure programs are the hallmark of most governments in the region, particularly in the Mashrek. And the decisions of deciding where investments will take place leave at the central level, they leave very little agency to the local level. But not only is colleagues planning and investment decisions centralized, the mechanisms for service delivery are centralized themselves. And so I think the main issue in this context is that while MENA countries often have made important advances towards decentralization, frontline service providers who really need to be accountable and empowered to make services available have very little agency. Next slide, please. The second issue is that politically driven investments in capital cities have really favored economic concentration in leading areas. So even though we are thinking about reducing spatial inequalities, the political bias exacerbates spatial inequalities. This is particularly true in the Masharq region. And the challenge, colleagues, is that the central transfers, which are really important because local revenue mobilization is weak, they are unpredictable and they're regressive. And what we see is countries often have no official formula or consistently applied set of criteria for making resource allocation decisions. In fact, often we have seen that in countries like Iraq, central government budgets are often allocated on cost spending decisions on population parameters and in a petrodollar formula that ends up favoring wealthier regions. And the chart that is in front of you is about Lebanon, where in fact the highest per capita investments are made in the leading regions of Beirut and its environs. So I think we got these major governance challenges. Next slide, please. And the policies, as Roberta mentioned, of reducing spatial inequity are in fact undermined by lack of local authority and resources. And those are decisions of whether we should be raising revenues, how do we make investment decisions, allocating resources, or delivering services. And I think as we go forward, and we have documented in the report, there's a really major role, colleagues, to move away from these large-scale capital investments. This obsession about building monuments. And these are these top-heavy centralized planning approaches. And we need to think about identifying local needs and tailoring solutions to local market failures, as Professor Samir, you mentioned in your opening. And this means that the model of the state will need to incorporate feedback. And this will need to empower local service providers so that they're not accountable to higher levels of government, but they're in fact accountable to the local residents. And our role probably is to build local capacity in government, in both human capacity and financial capacity. But it's easy to say this because what we have seen in reviewing the literature is that the hard stuff is the soft stuff. Because building monuments is straightforward, low-income countries can do it, and middle-income countries can do it. But in fact, changing the model to listen to local residents and incrementally changing incentives, that's very challenging. And that takes strong state capacity. And we need to think about changing the motivation of service providers so that they are agents of local residents and not agents only of their line ministries. So I'll leave you with a very positive slide, given that you have heard 40 minutes of very depressing tales, is that as we go forward in terms of reducing spatial inequalities, we need to have models where central government provides the ingredients, provides the signals, but let the local governments take their own place. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Soumik. I think you have made a fantastic argument for the importance of governance and how short this is in the Middle East, and what a great challenge we face in this area, and hopefully at some point it will be overcome. Roberta, before I give the floor to Hadi, is there anything you'd like to add after the speaker, after your colleagues have said what they have said?
So just a thought to sort of bring it all back together, Dr. Samir. So the idea I hope that we put on the table is that the challenges that the region faces now really are brewed into a by a governance deficit. Dr. Hoda showed the accountability side deficit, and Dr. Hans spoke about one element of transparency, which is the lack of data openness, and how the benefit and cost ratio is tilted objectively towards the need for more openness. Then what we saw with Dr. Federica and Dr. Somik are two applications of this concept of governance. In the case of jobs was the lack of the fear of listening to signals. Prices are signals, but prices are often controlled. Firms behave on the basis of prices that are controlled and markets that are not necessarily left to be competitive because of favoritism. And in the case of Somik, well, I won't summarize because we just heard it, but the tough stuff is really the soft stuff, is to listen, to measure, and to sort of progressively move towards objectives. So I just wanted to bring it all together, and we all look forward to the feedback and the comments by our honorable commentators and discussants. Thanks, Dr. Samir.
Thanks, Roberta. Is Noha on? Has Noha joined us or not yet? Shireen?
Dr. Noha is with us, and we would have Dr. Hadi go first, and then Dr. Noha, Dr. Samir. Thank you.
So Hadi hi Hadi. You're on now.
Greetings
Can you do it? Do you need more than 10 minutes?
Maybe. So
with
please be
12 minutes
with me.
12 minutes.
Well, we'll bargain when the time comes.
Okay. Go ahead, Hadi.
Listen way, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me start and thank the team from the World Bank for preparing this report and presenting it so well. So I'm really glad to be discussing it, although I'm going to be a bit critical. I hope they don't mind. So the report, A New State of Mind, asks, I believe, good questions about economic policy in the region, raises really important issues, and brings together vast literatures in different areas of research, and argues that increased transparency, accountability can enhance economic performance. It argues also for improving governance in product markets, in labor markets, in fiscal policy, for example, etc. Now, there are some new issues examined in the report, but it is mostly issues that we've discussed in the past. And there's some, of course, new evidence brought in some cases. For example, labor and product markets, limitations on women's participation, spatial disparities. The new evidence is very much welcome. I'm going to actually focus on one area because the time is limited: transparency and accountability as factors behind economic development. And the report examines that in some detail. There's some new evidence there, but it tries to argue about the pivotal role of trust in government institutions and incorporates different dimensions of accountability in the analysis. So what do we learn from this? The report's analysis of accountability and trust, I think, runs into a major dilemma that it does not solve. It finds, for example, that diagonal accountability is in fact negatively correlated with trust, and trust in institutions being a determinant of GDP, it seems that diagonal accountability is working against economic development. This is true, in fact, in the regressions about the connection between aggregate accountability and trust. So this is a major problem. And the report claims that countries with greater press freedom have less trust in institutions because of higher coverage of government corruption. I don't buy this. I think we need a better explanation of what's happening there And if that we accept this, then policy implication could be that maybe we should shut down some critical media and civil society organizations, which I don't like. So we need to really explore these a lot more deeply. Now, more generally about the governance and accountability, transparency, and economic development, I'm not sure exactly what the report talks about when it says about a new state of mind. Are we observing a new state of mind among politicians or the public, or are we trying to educate them to have a new state of mind about governance, about economic development? I'm even not sure who is the target audience for the report. For example, one key question is why policymakers in so many countries have been so slow to learn and do what the report argues or advocates. It seems that there's an implicit assumption at some points about politicians' objectives, that they're trying to improve welfare or they're interested in that. Probably that's the case, but there also might be an overwhelming desire on their part to preserve power. And that could be a completely different story. So in other words, what is it the report trying to achieve? Creating awareness about governance, about various aspects of economic development and various policy options, or something else? Are we educating ignorant but well-intentioned politicians, or are we trying to inform and mobilize the public to put pressure on the politicians? It would be good in future reports to think about these issues and try to sort of tailor the reports to who the audience might be and in what ways one might be able to promote the messages. So one of the things that I found a bit problematic is that the proposed reforms, they do take account of incentives that households and firms have and improving market performance, etc. That's well taken. But then we need to make sure that policies that we propose are incentive compatible for politicians too. What do I mean by this? Think about this example. An old debate, cash transfers or subsidized staple prices. A lot of governments in the region fix staple prices, bread or other items, fuel, and fix it in nominal terms until the price falls completely out of line with other prices, and then they adjust the prices. So that's one option. The other one is to give people cash transfers. And the report argues cash transfers are better. A lot of economists argue that cash transfers are better. And in many ways, theoretically, cash transfers are better. But politicians may understand that the advantage of cash transfers, the public may also understand that. But here's the problem. The real value of cash transfers may be eroded much more easily by inflation created by politicians, by policymakers, as opposed to the situation where you fix the price, and if the politicians create inflation, then in fact the real value of the transfer may actually increase rather than decrease. So, and because this gives the politicians an incentive to control inflation a little bit more, that may, or the public may perceive this as a better option because they can guarantee that some benefit from the subsidization is going to continue to come to them rather than cash transfers that are going to be eroded much more easily. So the public may actually prefer and put pressure on the politicians, as we've seen people come to the streets every time fuel prices go up or food prices go up and protest against price increases. So in that sense, we need to take into account how incentive compatible these policies are and which one is more feasible. Let me also point out a couple of more issues with the report. I'm not sure about the message that the report tries to give about transparency and accountability as a long-term growth strategy. But what I mean by not sure is that the evidence, the report tries to bring some evidence, but I'm not sure it's made the case for the connection between transparency, accountability, and growth. It's complicated. There's a lot of heterogeneity and simultaneity problem that I don't see addressed in the report or some other literature that they quote. In particular, think about the following. Governments tend to become less transparent when the economy is not doing very well, right? So they delay publication of data or try to tamper with the data, etc. So in that sense, it's from economic performance to transparency that the causality goes rather than the other way around. We really need to understand the underlying factors that drive both governance and economic development, economic growth, simultaneously, and make sure that we take account of those factors in our interpretation of the observed correlations. So, for example, let me show you one case where interpretation is kind of problematic. Do MENA countries have government deficit? This picture is used, or this graph is used to argue that. But think about it this way. Should we include oil rents in GDP when we make these kinds of comparisons? A country, let's suppose, that suddenly discovers a huge amount of oil and starts exporting it, its GDP jumps up. Do we expect that country to have the same accountability, the same governance institutions as countries that have grown over time and their GDP comes from the productivity of their labor rather than exporting natural resources? So in fact, if we look at this graph, there's something really strange. In MENA, you can see that there's a negative relationship between governance and per capita income. So the lower accountability, the higher GDP per capita. That's one other way of looking at the same graph in MENA region. So let me actually flip this a bit more and ask more questions about the same graph. Or maybe MENA countries are short of governance capabilities, and they're really using it very efficiently to produce lots of income, right? If you want to see it that way, let's start with the government accountability on the horizontal axis and put the GDP per capita on the vertical axis and flip that graph that we had before. And now you can see that GDP per capita is much higher for a given government accountability. Which one is the correct interpretation? And again, here you can see the negative relationship between GDP per capita and accountability in the graph. So we really need to understand the underlying forces that shape both governance and economic development in the region in order to be able to come up with good policy recommendations. So one last slide, and issue that I want to discuss. I'm going to finish with this. Statistical capacity is likely to help policy as argued in this panel, and that's very good to the extent that the additional, of course, politicians would provide the data or would publish the data, make it public if they see that's serving their purpose. Or maybe if the governments are indeed into the business of helping people and improving welfare, which is not always the case, and we need to take that into account. Transparency, for example, may be good and that's often very good. But think about it this way, that sometimes powerful lobbies may block policy reforms if the information about those reforms become available too early. So on this, let me just show this graph, and this is just something minor that I wanted to point out. I'm not sure this picture is really complete. I work on the case of Iran, and I'm very familiar with the data sets in Iran. And I'm actually working with the establishment survey, which is carried out annually in Iran. And it shows it's not done and it's not available. So it's done. Availability is a bit questionable because you have to go to the statistical office to be able to use the data set. And also there's census that is collected regularly and data is made available. So I'm a bit surprised that in the table here, it's missing. So that's just for the information of the research team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hadi. I think you've raised a number of good questions for the authors to ponder and respond to. Is Noha with us? Noha Al-Makawi.
Yes, I am.
Noha?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I hear you. Noha, with 10 minutes due. Okay,
definitely.
Go ahead.
Definitely. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's quite an interesting conversation and quite an important report. Dr. Samir, Dr. Hadi, and Roberta, and the team have all made my life a bit easier. So I'll try to stick to the 10 minutes and cognizant of how much limited time we have for the audience to pose questions. I think this report is a good comeback to a theme that has already been advocated by the World Bank in its 2020 report, How Transparency Can Help the Middle East and North Africa. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
So I sincerely welcome the World Bank's effort to continue to ground the conversation on governance in the MENA region. Now, the report on the learning state explains early on that it is not a report on political regimes, not a report on democracy. This is a welcome nuance in an age of heightened risk of ideological Cold War, given the democracy autocracy narrative that the USA is adopting. But the report also distances itself to some extent from the debate around the role of the state. Though the report considers transparency and accountability as needed ingredients of good governance, whichever role the state assumes. Here is where I want to take issue with the report. I will have 3 points to make, very much encouraged by Roberta's phrase about the fear of listening to signals. And I am very intrigued by the politics of fear in general, and actually also this exact same point, the specific fear of listening to signals. Now, my first point, the development and political science literature abound with books and journal articles about the role of the state in development. How does transparency and accountability, particularly data transparency, fare in the developmental state model? How does it, or would it fare in an entrepreneurial state model? When the state intervenes in industrial policy, or when it becomes a de-risking actor that injects public resources and investment, does it continue to be vested in the accessibility of good quality data? Does it continue to be an enabler of accountability mechanisms? The same is true for the captured state and the state as enterprise. 2 narratives about the state that may resonate well in many parts of the MENA region. When the ruling elite are captured by private vested interests, when there is a collision of political, economic, and identity-based powers, all of which enhance the impunity of some and the impoverishment of many, is the state motivated to learn? The MENA region had a social contract back in the 60s which promised prosperity if citizens give up their freedoms. The narrative since 2010, 2011 has been promising security if citizens exercise loyalty and resilience in the face of hardships. The narrative in MENA from now on may become one where the polity is an enterprise. In that sort of state, the citizen takes a back seat, the investor in an enclave economy or the resident in a gated community takes the front seat. This is the underlying power dynamic of spatial inequality that this report so highly and well highlights. Is there an incentive in such a state for learning? My guess is that we need to build a research agenda that links the role of the state in the MENA region with the motivation for learning. The role of the state is at the core of the development narrative. I'm not arguing for a deterministic approach. Developmental states or entrepreneurial states could be put on a spectrum from weak on transparency and accountability to strong on either or both. Same goes for the state as enterprise and the entrepreneurial state. So some more research and evidence would be further needed here to correlate the role of the state with the motivation for learning. Secondly, transparency and accountability are not technical matters. And if they are, they need to be enabled by cultural shifts. Here is a role for the state. Enhanced accountability doesn't follow in an automatic way from data transparency. There need to be societal participation, deliberation of policy, using the data made available in a transparent manner. State institutions are assumed to take on the role of regulators of a level playing field in a culture of dialogue, one that creates a safe space for participation and societal commentary on policy failures. This requires that we look at transparency and accountability in the context of an ecosystem where the state is a fair regulator of that ecosystem. It's an ecosystem for dialogue, an ecosystem for whistleblowers and for debate. This ecosystem includes many actors, civil society, media, as well as educational institutions, research centers, and research networks. These are custodians of the human capital that this report also points to. But they are not custodians of human capital in the sense of churning out into the labor market workers. They are custodians of the human capital that produces policy analysts and hopefully future policy makers who are learners. Transparency and accountability requires a state that understands this ecosystem and understands its role as a guarantor of a level playing field among those actors. It would complement this report to think of transparency and accountability in the context of a larger ecosystem of actors. The role of the learning state is not only to make good quality data available, but also to ensure and enable a debate culture. Finally, there are two spoiling narratives that would weaken the message of this report. One narrative distrusts societal participation and societal access to data. I have discussed this a little bit in my comments so far. The second spoiling narrative for this report is distrust in public administration. We are in an age of distrust of public administration. Development failures, when not attributed to unforeseen shocks, are attributed to incompetent public administration and bureaucracy, and that narrative makes it easy to accept parallel systems of policy making and policy implementation. Such parallel systems are invisible actors in a learning culture that this report wants to see grow in the MENA region. How do we motivate public administration to become a learning machinery, and how to engage invisible actors in a learning culture? I can summarize it all in one point. Transparency and accountability require a nuanced understanding of an ecosystem of learning, where the role of the state is critical. This is fundamentally a power analysis. Analyses of power that underline governance and learning would be important in order to operationalize the recommendations of this important report, bringing it closer to the lived realities of millions of MENA regional residents. And I second a lot of the questions raised by my dear colleague Hadi, and thank you, Roberta and the team, for making this conversation possible. Back to you, Dr. Singh.
Thank you very much. Dr. Samir Maghdisi's got a power cut, so I'm hoping he'd be joining us. He's trying to rejoin. Thank you all the speakers for an excellent, rich discussion. We have a couple of questions, and we have Dr. Ibrahim with us, and we'd like to give the opportunity to our speakers to actually also address the issues raised by our lead commentators. If I may, I'll just bring to the attention of the speakers and our panelists the questions that are raised in the Q&A. One is from Dr. Angus Blair. I think we'll agree that better transparency is vital everywhere, but the issue is how this is transformed into a culture of willing transparency. Can anyone pick this up in terms of practical ideas? And there's also another intervention from Professor Dr. Ahmed Qadri Bahloul, that the main conclusion is a question on validity of results. I think the team may want to add a section on limitation of the study and suggestions for future research. With that, I'll keep an eye on making sure Dr. Samir joins in as soon as possible, and give the floor back to Roberta to address as relevant.
Thank you, Dr.
Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Shireen. And Dr. Samir is back.
Yes. Roberta, we were just cut off, although we have a generator here for 24 hours. We just come up for a few minutes, so I think it's a good example of what's happened to this country. I thank you very much. I did not listen to the last few paragraphs that you have said, but I assume they were as good as the first half of your presentation. How much time do we have, Shireen?
We've got another 15 minutes, and I've just shared the questions we have from the floor, and I was just about to give Roberta the floor back to start addressing as relevant.
Go ahead, please go ahead, Roberta, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Shireen, and thank you, Dr. Samir, but especially thank you, Dr. Hadi and Dr. Noah. I know already I won't be able to give justice to the richness of your comments, but let me address a few big questions that you put on the floor, and I hope that my colleagues, I see Dr. Hoda still connected. I hope that Dr. Hans and Dr. Somika are also still connected, because there's also there are also important questions for them. So let me start from the beginning. I think Dr. Hadi asked, what is this really about? Who is this learning state? What are we talking about? And so I think we're talking about the government and the bureaucracy, and I hope you will forgive me for not being precise here. But, and I beg the forgiveness when I go to what is the objective. So Dr. Hadi says something which I think is true. This is a little bit of old wine in, I hope, a little bit of a new bottle. And the objective is a bit of both of what you brought about. Some awareness, some informing, and especially salience. So just to give you a sense of where we were coming from to this agenda, Dr. Obaretsky and then myself, when I took on his position, have been shepherding a large analytical agenda, the one where you would find a lot of the robustness checks, endogeneity conversation, sort of causality discussions that you don't find in this volume, to prepare for the Marrakesh meetings in 2023. And so we have been issuing new flagships on different themes. For example, Dr. Federica and Dr. Asif led the flagship on jobs, and then there was one on land. One is going to come up on land, which will be launched next week, one on water that will be launched in March, one on digital development, migration, and so on. So we were exposed to this richness of analytical pursuits. And I was thinking, how are we going to put it together in a narrative that sort of describes where is the region now, the turning point of the region. And the more we reflected on these different parts of this agenda, it was really that the common factor was better governance would have been the transformational shift. And so that's where we land in terms of where this edited volume, which is probably closer to some pieces, if I want to be, to flatter ourselves, that might go on foreign policy rather than an article that will be published on a peer referees journal where they will look and like, what is the sort of spurious correlation here and there? So I don't know that we made the case on based on causality here in this report, but the analytical agenda on which it is based, both the one that we shepherd and the one that is in the published world, think about the seminal work of Acemoglu on the role of institution in long-term development. I think it has made the case that governance is fundamental. It is about institution, more so than development. It might be about, I don't know, trade, let's say. Now, I think that Dr. Hadi made a very clever point. Is it MENA very efficient in using governance to produce that much output with that little governance? Nice point. However, the point that we try to make in this report is that MENA, for the region that we know and that you know much better than us, is so much below where it could be. So there is a sense of a frontier of where the region could be with its demographic dividend, with its resources, with its history, culture, and beauty, and it's not there. And I think that that statement might be clear in the same way as the cause theorem is clear on a clear day, without the proof, but just by intuition. Now, I think that both our discussant made a very important point about, okay, you make a point, so what? And Dr. Noah put it in a very clear and crystal clear way. Where are the incentives to learn? And one of the questions in the chat is like, okay, so what's the practical ramification of this? So I think that this conversation about transparency and accountability, and about a state that learns, that measures, that crosses the river by feeling the stones, is particularly important now, because now uncertainty has increased. Shocks have increased. So even the sort of technical recipes of development that we were putting forth before might not be working now and might not be working all the way. Second, I think Dr. Hans brought to bear, I think, an important point. For when we look at transparency and data openness, the cost-benefit ratio has changed. And it has changed in a way so that the cost of keeping the keeping the data under wrap are much higher than the actual potential cost, political cost, that might come to an administration. Lastly, we're in a moment where part of the countries in our region are in dramatic shortage of fiscal resources, and any governance reform is actually cheap fiscally, although it's costly in terms of social and political capital. But if you think about the countries that are doing better these days because of high oil prices, even oil-rich countries now face an agenda of 2030 or 2040, where they need to move away from an economy that is solely based on fuel to an economy that has output that is broader based, because the demand due to the climate change crisis for oil will be changing. And if we look at the convergence of prices of oil for 2030, it will be around 70, which is something that countries that are oil rich are coping with right now. So in terms of incentives to learn, I think we observe that the cost-benefit analysis of not learning switches the benefit much more towards the learning. In terms of examples that we even see now, what are opportunities for change? Some of them are crises. Was the pandemic enough to make a big change? Maybe not. Is the current economic difficulties that Egypt is facing, and that is now addressing very clearly with strong statements on moving out from many sectors for SOEs, enterprise is moving towards private sector growth, maybe it is in a crisis that I wouldn't say the incentive compatibility comes to bear for these reforms, but when these reforms become almost necessary. I'd like to conclude with an appreciation of an important point that Dr. Noah made about this is not just a technical story. So we hope that by informing and increasing awareness, we put in motion a debate that eventually would affect the culture, and a culture of not what to do. So here at the World Bank, we're not telling as country X should have a reform in area Y and change this and change that. We're just trying to argue that it should, our countries, our governments, the bureaucracies should change the way in which they do things so that they are more cognizant of signals, be them prices, being the voice of civil society, being the ecosystem that Dr. Noah was referring to actually give internally feedback to what works and what doesn't. But let me stop here and see if my colleague, Dr. Hans, Federica, Dr. Hoda would like to come in with their consideration on these excellent comments that we received. So it's also for us a way to sort of crossing the river while feeling the stones and getting excellent feedback on how then round 2 of this agenda, our research agenda, could look like. But
Thank
over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Roberta, but let us try to be as brief as possible with your colleagues' comments. Go ahead if anyone would like to make comments.
Dr. Samir, may I interject just for a second to thank everyone and apologize sincerely that I need to leave the session right now. Otherwise, I miss my ride back home.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Noha, very much for being with us.
Thank you for a wonderful session, and I'm sorry I'm gonna miss the rest of the team's comments. But Roberta, much appreciate your interventions. Thank you. Bye bye.
Safe driving. Would any of Roberta's colleagues like to make further comments on what has been said?
I can.
Dr. Samir, if I may, Dr. Heba, Professor Heba Handousa would like, has her hand raised, and Dr. Heba Handousa.
Heba, yeah, sure.
And also Dr. Ibrahim Badawi would like to have the floor at some point.
Heba, go ahead. Heba.
Good afternoon.
Ahlan, Heba.
I was going to inquire with Hadi Esfahani. Hello, Hadi. Because I haven't read the report, but the subject is so vital at this point in our experience as economists and political scientists and so on in the region. My feeling is that most of our countries are ready to become more open, especially with information. I think Egypt has done a huge transformation in terms of the availability, the production of good data, the speed with which you get new information. We have a poverty map which couldn't be more detailed at the village level for upwards of 40,000 villages in Egypt. And it's done every 3 years. So, for instance, when I'm working in the south, okay, so I'm so happy with the quality of the data and its availability that I feel that this is not where the problem lies. You know, the sharing of data is not the best indicator of what's happening in policy making. It's far more in, you know, how much sharing of where we are and what the options are and what what are the you know the requirements given the constraints that any government or any economy is raising, and learning from one another within our region, the MENA region, because I think we've had so many success stories. I'm an industrial economist. I And I can see what's happening in Morocco, for instance, and I'm very proud of it. And others like Egypt who are not doing anything on industrialization to speak of. So, I beg to differ about it's being an access to information that's the problem. I think things like, for instance, the size of the public sector that's still around, the economic policies themselves, rather than availability of data as a measure or an use of data. Again, if you look at the concerns of policymakers with the poor, I don't think we've ever had it that good for at least 100 years in Egypt, that there should be so much concern with developing the south. The south of Egypt is it represents only 40% of Egypt, but 95% of poverty in Egypt. It's amazing. And that's what the government has spent huge amounts with borrowing from the World Bank, etc., etc. So we're much more where we're behind is very much issues of the governance, in the sense of the communities making decisions at the village level and at the governorate level and deciding on priorities of spending. It's not that the spending is going to the wrong governorates, or on the contrary. So I think I'd love to see that report, but I would say that we need to use it, but accompany it with a lot more information on other aspects and other indicators of government, of governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiba. Brahim? We don't have much time, Brahim, but if you can be brief if possible.
Yes, I'll be very brief. I actually just want to say that I'm delighted that even though I came late, I was out of town. I just arrived this afternoon, maybe half an hour late, but I managed to catch some of these very interesting presentation. I'm really delighted that the World Bank and the MENA region has produced this very timely report, because I think we all talk about the importance of information and data, and I think this is a very important contribution, and I hope that we could actually use the findings of this report to hopefully maybe become more persuasive and convincing to the statistics bureaus in the different countries, because I fully agree with Professor Handousa that Egypt has made significant strides in terms of collecting and sharing data, and ERF has been a main beneficiary of the collaboration with CATMAS. It has been really a great partnership, but it has been uneven, unfortunately, within the region. There are several countries, middle-income countries in the region, that they really don't share data, and that certainly is a problem of unevenness here. But I wanted actually substantively to make two quick comments. One of them is I didn't actually read the report in full, but I got the impression that there is one missing element, which is evaluation. So it would have been great to see the learning and evaluative state, because I think learning and evaluating regulation and policies and interventions would be very useful for social learning. And it has been credited, evaluation and social learning has been, credited for the development and the transformation that happens in East Asia. And I think that is definitely missing, in our region. The second point I want to raise is that actually I think this report also reflect a very important current in thinking, because Stefan Herdog from LSE produced recently a very interesting book. It's focused on the Arab world, but of course, most of MENA. It's called Locked Out of Development. And his argument was that the state is very uneven in terms of regulation and in terms of distribution of resources. And he had some sort of a little theory to explain why this is an impediment, a major impediment to productivity and growth and export performance and so on, because almost like there is a feedback loop that the state actually overregulate and also underperform in terms of distribution of resources. So this unevenness creates insiders and outsiders. These insiders could be coastal regions, could be urban consumers, and outsiders could be producers in agriculture or small-scale industry or informal sector and so on, or population or communities in the interior. And so the fact that those insiders are much more effective politically as opposed to the outsiders, this kind of creates some sort of a low trap equilibrium and undermine. So I think, I see a lot of parallels and overlap between this, the maintenance of this report and this new book, which I think is quite interesting. And we actually already asked him to write a blog for us for the ERF portal. Thank you very much again. And
thank you,
really
Ibrahim.
Appreciate the opportunity to host the presentation of this report. Thank you,
Ibrahim. Thank you, Ibrahim. Any other comments from Roberta's colleagues? Short comments.
Yes, I just have one. I just want to just reply to some of the comments by Dr. Hedi and Dr. Nuha. So one thing that was mentioned was the negative correlation that was found between diagonal accountability and trust. And I don't think that here the results should be interpreted as having higher diagonal accountability or having more press freedom means that people do not trust government. What it means is that taken as a whole, if you only have diagonal accountability without the other kinds of accountability as vertical and horizontal accountability, greater coverage of, for example, government corruption, without having the complete framework whereby the government can be held accountable to that corruption, would lead to people trusting less in the government. And this is actually a result that was found in previous research that looked at press freedom and coverage of corruption for for democracies, for non-democracies, for example. And they found that in countries where there is no framework of holding the government accountable, more press freedom meant less trust in the government. So I think that the results here should be interpreted as that we need all dimensions of accountability, because we need the diagonal accountability to inform the public, but we also need vertical and horizontal accountability to hold the government accountable to these information. And also another thing that was mentioned about the relationship between accountability and GDP per capita, and with the scatter plot that shows how MENA countries underperform. So here, the idea was not necessarily looking at a causal relationship between economic growth and accountability, but rather, as Roberta mentioned, seeing how MENA countries perform compared to their income comparators, and therefore what they would be capable of, or they would be able to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think our time is up, and permit me to thank Roberta for a very, very important book that has very important key messages that should be discussed. And in fact, its importance is not only in the key messages it has, but in the reactions from Hadi and Noha and Ibrahim and Hiba and everybody to them, that will make you perhaps rethink some of the points that have been raised in the book. But it is a very important venture, in what ought to be done in this part of the world. Thank you all for your presence, and I will not go name my name, but thank you, ERF, for organizing, and the World Bank for organizing this very, very important seminar. Thank you all, and bye-bye.